Welcome to DOC NYC's inaugural Spring Showcase, our mid-year celebration of documentary films and series. I'm Brandon Harrison, features programmer here at DOC NYC, and it's my pleasure to be speaking with multi-hyphenate director Steve James and also multi-hyphenate producer Zak Piper from Nat Geo's City So Real. How are you guys doing?
Great.
Oh, thank you.
How are you?
I'm great. I had the pleasure of being taken on a journey through Chicago and everything about it. I wanted to start about, your relationship. You guys have done a number of projects together or worked on different projects. And this film is series is so expansive in terms of the breadth in your approach. Is there any way that when you decided we're going to do this project, you differed in your approach or decided you're going to take a certain way because it's an undertaking?
It is an undertaking. When we started out, it was just going to be a standalone documentary, but it didn't become that because we kind of got sucked into the vortex and there was just a lot going on, as there always is in Chicago. And I think the one thing that's different about this project for me and Zak from previous projects that we've done is we decided that we were really going to take this approach to it that was expansive and inclusive as we could make it, meaning, we would go out with certain things in mind that we wanted to get and people we wanted to spend time with, but then we also wanted to remain completely open to where the stories took us, where our journeys on even a given day took us. And that's why you find there's all these sort of, for us, these serendipitous moments where people kind of enter the series that we had no idea were going to be a part of the series, like Tracy, the Uber driver, or the older couple at the early voting site. These were all examples, Maine, the shoe shine guy. These were all examples of people that we came across, were interested in, they were interested in us, and they became part of the film.
Curious about Zak's thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Steve laid it out pretty well, but it was very different from other types of films where, you're much more planned. And just to underscore what Steve said is, I mean, we would have a sense of what was happening that day. But as soon as we arrived at wherever our meeting spot was, we would, keep our ears open and our eyes on social media and see what else was happening. Go through our list of people we'd call or text in various campaigns, following up with people around the city. And we would just go wherever. And it took a minute to get into that rhythm, it really did. But then once we got into the rhythm, it felt so natural and free that it's honestly hard to go back to the old way, I think. I feel like this way wants to remain part of the system, the new system.
I mean, you talk about the way it's sort of built organically. I'm curious, how did that go with the story? Because it feels like, this is like this thing about the Laquan McDonald case. And then we have this parallel mayoral race case. And then, of course, we saw the past year and a half what happened, between the racial uprising and COVID and all these things. How did you're shooting this in the process, but on the end, when you're doing this editing process and you're working with the team, how do you decide what we're going to focus on and what the story is going to look like?
Well, that's part of the reason why it went from being a standalone to a miniseries, because there were just so many aspects to it that we didn't feel should be left out, that there was so much to include. And, I'm one of the editors, along with David Simpson, who is someone that's worked with me and Zak for a long time. And, I think our first cut was something like 12 hours.
It was.
And, and even at that, we left, because I went through to decide what we were going to edit to begin with. And I picked about 97 scenes and I left 100 out you know. So, you know, you think, well, geez, we cut everything. We didn't. But based on that, we decided this wanted to be this kind of expansive undertaking that yes, the mayoral race and Laquan McDonald are kind of twin pillars, if you will, of the series. But, you know, there's Lincoln Yards, there's gentrification, and then there's the portraiture of people that we encounter. Because, you know, if we had made it more confined, if we had said, okay, this has got to be a standalone, I think there would have been a lot of pressure to lose a lot of the everyday people that don't push the narrative forward, if you will. But, you know, they were the heart and soul of what we were doing, so we didn't want to do that.
I mean, I enjoyed that as well, because that was the best part of it. Like the humanity that was placed upon everybody in the city, the breadth of what you see in Chicago. I'm curious, you're talking about that cutting room table. Is there any gem, that baby that, you know, we may have not got the chance to enjoy as viewers, that was something that you really loved, that, you know, a character or a moment that was just awesome and we weren't privy to?
Well, you're thinking of that. I could say we did, you know, have more access to some of the campaigns than we reveal in the series. It's just a lot of that, you know, it was interesting on a personal level, but that didn't necessarily fit into the film. The idea that, you know, we're seeing the inner workings of a campaign, and we had, you know, a lot of footage that could have supported that kind of film, but that wasn't the vision. And I'm glad we didn't include it. And
you know, there was a number of scenes that there were two other scenes that we shot with Chance the Rapper and Amara that were good scenes. One of them, they went to a local afternoon show that's been on for a long time here in Chicago called Windy City Live. And they were on that, and it was pretty, you know, it was pretty great and pretty hilarious. And I mean, Chance is just, you know, amazingly charismatic, as is Amara. So that was a lot of fun. And then we shot a fundraiser for them that was at the Chop House, you know, which is another kind of Chicago institution. And again, both were great scenes, but, you know, we did have to make some hard choices down the road. And then there was one candidate that dropped out of the race early that we spent a lot of time filming with, who was really an amazing candidate too, but we just decided, you know, we had to make, believe it or not, we made some hard decisions.
With that point about it, you know, it being not this total political film, but in character terms, this Lori Lightfoot character, right? I don't know what the initial view of like this character was when I was looking at the polls, and I wasn't following Chicago politics that closely to know that she was at what 0.8 or whatever percent, and now this person that made passing glance and one of the major figures of your film. How did that sort of happen and go for you guys, and what was it like putting together the film?
Well, it sort of happened the way you see in the film. I mean, you mentioned that, you know, you weren't paying attention to, you know, Lori Lightfoot and her, you know, her as a character or whatever. I don't think people in Chicago were paying close attention for a while either. You know, the fact that I think 2 or 3 weeks out, she was polling, you know, low single digits, and she kind of got her footing. We noticed it on the campaign trail, her style, her toughness, her, you know, she's a fighter, and she was put in this position in the campaign, and she kind of rose to the moment and was a really strong candidate. And as far as her emergence, it just sort of happened. It did kind of happen over the course of weeks. You know, she got an endorsement from the Sun-Times, and it just rose from there.
I mean, the irony, Brandon, is that we identified Lori early on as someone that was of great interest to us to follow, even when no one thought she had a chance to win, which was for the longest time. And we reached out to the campaign. She was one of the very first candidates that we reached out to. She might have been the first candidate we reached out to. But we had a real struggle with her PR team. They just didn't want her to do this. And she personally liked the idea of it. And so when Zach and I were out shooting, we might document a press conference that she did early on, and she would be like, I know you guys want to film. I know, you know. We'll work it out. We'll work it out. And eventually we were able to sidestep the PR people and just deal directly with her. And that's how we got the access. And we were lucky that that began to really happen as she started to really find her footing as a candidate. So it felt organically like you were discovering her in the series. And thank God, given what happened, we were able to prevail, because it would have been a real drag if we didn't have her in the series. Mm-hmm. We didn't expect to have direct access to the winner, because most of the front runners didn't want to give us that kind of access because they didn't have anything to gain from it. You know, they only had to lose in their mind. If they became mayor and we had something embarrassing for them, that wouldn't be good. So many of the alleged front runners, you know, declined to let us in, even though we did document them. Mm-hmm. In various ways, and they're in the movie. But the people that let us in tended to be candidates who were considered more minor candidates, and in this case, that one of those minor candidates became mayor.
With that process, that juggling and talking to different candidates, talking to the individual people and all the different subjects, what was it like, you know, with the entirety of your team? I'm curious, you know, field producers, all these things. You guys have so many interesting characters, from the barber, and even you mentioned the Uber drivers, all these people, both barbershops, the bar, all these people that I were like, such characters, like very great. What was that process like of, you know, maintaining that and building those relationships and your team?
We had a great team. It's funny that, you know, some people have assumed that we had like multiple cameras shooting every day, which was not the case. We didn't have that kind of resources to do that. We were much more seat of our pants. Mm-hmm. But we had two excellent field producers in Sylvetta Christmas and Jania Smith, who were quite helpful, particularly in the Black community, in terms of finding us great places to go and people and get access to people. Kevin Shaw, who was one of the directors on America to Me with the series that I did before this, and that Zach worked on quite a bit. You know, he came on board as one of the DPs too. He's a Black DP. He shot the Black Barbershop, and I think I was there, but I think it made all the difference in the world that our crew that day happened to be much more representative of the community we were filming. And I think it just led to a different kind of level of intimacy than I think, you know, I would get. Whereas when we went to the white barbershop, that was me and Zach. You know, if Kevin had gone to shoot that scene wouldn't have unfolded the way it did, without question. So, and then my son, I have to give a big shout out to my son, Jackson, who was one of the primary DPs on this. And he did a terrific job, and he brought a kind of youthful eye and vigor that I think, you know, really benefited the series. He did some really terrific work.
And I'll just add one detail, which is, you know, just about Steve and you know, the intentionality behind some of this. You're talking about, you know, finding all these great characters. Well, you know, the example of the barbershop that Steve brought up, the Black Barbershop, which was a really incredible scene. I mean, after that scene was shot, you know, Steve is, you know, thinking of where, you know, what would it be like inside of a white barbershop? So we intentionally went out and tried to find a white barbershop. Now, we didn't know it was going to be one filled with a bunch of ex-cops, but we were just trying to find like a classic neighborhood spot. Same thing for the Bears game. You know, it was like, okay, that same idea. Let's find a far northwest side bar that's going to be mostly white, and let's find a south side or west side bar that's mostly going to be Black. And so we try to figure out what kind of, you know, who's going to be there, just to try to create these, you know, to find these places that might be filled with some of these characters that then become part of the series.
Yeah, and Jania, who I mentioned earlier, is the one that turned us on to the presidential lounge on the south side, and that ended up being a great location. We didn't really want to leave there by halftime because it was so much fun, but we had to get to the north side bar, so we had to go.
We had the length of halftime to get up north.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was,
Yeah, because we didn't have two crews. We if we were rich guys, we could have had two crews in two different places, but
right.
we didn't do that.
What's interesting to me is that something very expansive. Again, we're talking about how everyone's being perceived, that they're being recorded. You're in the black barbershop. What do they think? Versus like you have a black crew in the white barbershop, and all these moments where people are expecting, I don't know, to be talked about race in Chicago. Everyone seemed to have a very historical understanding of Chicago. I don't know if your average citizen in every city has that. What was it just like working with the everyday citizen and hearing their opinions and thoughts on the culture of the city?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're right. I think one of the things that makes Chicago special, and I can't speak for other cities because this is the city I know best, but I think one of the things that makes Chicago special is just how engaged people are here, and particularly politically. Chicago is the birthplace of community organizing in America. And, it's interesting that in the wake of George Floyd, a lot of the protests and things that went on around the country, I think, obviously New York is well, I'm not talking about New York when I say this, but the eruption of protests that happened across the country was a newer experience, I think, for a lot of people, particularly at the level it was happening. Whereas in Chicago, that was just that's the way it is here. And even, with Laquan McDonald or the mayoral race or issues of police and building an academy on the west side of Chicago, it's like there is a level of engagement here on these issues on the part of many of the citizens that I think is quite amazing here. So that when George Floyd at that point, in terms of what was going on.
I wanted to talk about a particular scene because I feel like it fit sort of that analysis that you talked about that you wouldn't normally say, and it's the dinner party scene. I enjoyed it very much, and I thought it was like a good take on the way these conversations go. Can you just guys talk about that scene and how that came to be?
Well, yeah, I mean that, it's interesting. We kind of knew that we wanted to have some kind of like highfalutin dinner party, with opinion leaders or something, and so I actually reached out to Chaz Ebert, Roger Ebert's wife, who, we got to know quite well when we made the film on Roger and Chaz. And Chaz is so connected in Chicago. I like to say I'm the least connected person in Chicago. She's the most connected. And she's the one that suggested Christy Hefner, who I'd met, but said Christy does these dinners from time to time. And I think it's exactly what it is you're looking for. And so with Chaz's encouragement, I reached out to Christy and she was very receptive. And we were able to go to this dinner and film. And it's one of my favorite scenes in the movie too, because it's a part of, the cognoscenti, the intelligentsia or whatever of Chicago and how they view the city. And there were real differences of opinion around that table, right? But it's a whole different level, and I don't mean level in a judgmental sense, but it's a different way in which people engage with their city than a lot of the people we were spending time with in the streets, and how they engage with their city.
But they were on a different level, and the fact that they were on the 40th floor having those conversations, overlooking the city at night, it's like an amazing, backdrop for the conversation. It's
pretty apparent thematically. It's like, oh God, the towers and looking out. I was like, can't write that.
Right.
So a thing that I'm curious about too, is the sort of coda episode, right? You have this build up and all these things in Chicago, and we have last year, which was just a culture wrenching moment, both in terms of production and then in terms of what that ended up being for the film. You guys just talk about that last episode and how that came together and sort of how you feel about the residents.
You know, last year we premiered the first couple episodes at Sundance. We thought we were done after 4 episodes. And then we hadn't sold the series and the pandemic hit. And so that was, I think, around late March, early April. Steve texted me and said, hey, you know, kicking around the idea of doing some follow-up, just Zoom interviews with some of the folks from the series. So we brainstormed a list, and over the next month or so started to try to get those together slowly and look, reach back out to folks and see if we did like a little follow-up. Maybe it's 10 or 15, 20 minutes long. And then when George Floyd was murdered, and all the protests started happening, we had already been kind of slowly in production for 6, 7, 8 weeks on this episode. And this was just kind of like, okay, we have to, this is definitely absolutely part of, I mean, things were happening in the city that, you know, we hadn't seen in over a generation, in terms of like, you know, civic action and people marching in the streets. And so we just kind of dug in and got back in the groove as best we could, given that COVID was happening. But, you know, it was a lot of, we crammed, you know, that entire episode. Obviously we filmed it just over the course of the summer, and, you know, had to finish it, cut it together by early fall. So it all came together very quickly. But it felt like it did feel like it was kind of like a crystallization of what was happening in the city in the first 4 episodes, kind of just, you know, reached a peak in the summer of 2020.
Yeah, and I would add to that, it's like there were a couple of things that really appealed to us in addition. One was, as Zach said, was to reach back out to people that we had gotten to know in the first 4 episodes. Mm-hmm. And I think part of what appealed to us about that was, it's one thing to experience the pandemic as the pandemic. It's another thing if you feel like you're actually rooted in people's lives and then see how it's impacted them. And so we reached out back to Rev, one of the barbers at the Black Barbershop, for example. He shows up in the episode, and to see how things were going for him. We reconnected with some of the candidates for mayor, and we did that. But the other piece of it that was really appealing to us, I think, is we felt like, you know, when we leave off at the end of episode 4, Lori Lightfoot has come out of nowhere and she's won this race, and it's this kind of amazing victory. And now we love the idea of, okay, now it's a year later, what's going on now? You know, what's it like to govern? Okay, we know what it's like to run and win an improbable victory. What's it like to govern? And, you know, she was certainly has had her share of struggles as mayor of Chicago. And so it was really, you know, we spent a lot of time, both in how we shot and in the editing, is trying to calibrate how we show her, that we give her an opportunity to speak for herself and express what she, you know, believes and is trying to do, and at the same time to hear from people who are not happy with her as mayor of Chicago. And the edit happened like, this is the fastest editing on anything I've ever done. And I think it was due to a couple of things. One was, you know, I had a tremendous co-editor in David Simpson. You know, he and I have worked together a lot over the years, so we were able to kind of kick it into high gear pretty quickly. And the other thing is, we had no choice. Yeah, it had to go on the air in October, and it was like, we have to do it. So we just did it. And of course, it ended up being long because that's what I do. But you know, but hopefully it's interesting.
So, I mean, I think this is going to be my last question, but I really want you guys to think about it, because I feel like it was a theme down to the graphics And the things that many of the subjects had said is that Chicago is a city of neighborhoods and these individual pockets of all these different cultures and people and ethno-linguistic classes, socio-economic classes, so many different groups of people and where they are placed around this area. And ultimately, as filmmakers, what would you want people to take away from your portrait of, this city of neighborhoods?
Go ahead, Zach.
I'm taking his.
You go first.
I'm taking Brandon's. Think about this really close. I'm really taking that to heart.
Give you a moment to ponder.
Yeah, give me a moment to ponder. I mean, whenever you talk about,
well, I can start if you want.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, no, go ahead. You look like you got it now. Go ahead.
Well, I just was going to start talking and hope that I got somewhere a little bit, because I'm just thinking of in terms. No, you could, because you framed the question in terms of neighborhoods, which is what threw me off a little bit. It wasn't just about what do you want someone to take from this series, and I think whenever I think about neighborhoods and how different they are, and think of them as little towns that had, most of them had a heyday that's really not today. That's an exception for some neighborhoods are experiencing their best times right now. But I look at all that and I always think about, just the history of how, why are this group of people living here and this group of people living over here. And I sort of feel like, part of, Chicago in its own way is like such an example of, almost like mandated, segregation, the way that they built the highway and the way that, ethnic neighborhoods have survived or not, or are struggling now. And I guess with that as the backdrop, I guess the one takeaway is, I guess no matter where we're going around the city, and whatever that situation is for that particular neighborhood or that, group of people, however they identify, that it's, we're finding people that are, hopeful about the city and the future, and who are, like Steve said earlier, really engaged and really interested in their own particular community, whatever that community is. And, it manifests itself in a really well organized, citizenry that goes out on the street and marches and yields power.
Yeah, and I would just add, it's like, there's pride in Chicago that Chicagoans have, and then there's pride in neighborhood that people in individual neighborhoods have. Mm. And there's pride about being a South Sider versus a West Sider. I don't think anybody brags about being a North Sider, but maybe they do. But so people take pride in differing ways, and geography plays a role in all of that, I think, in this city, in their community. But so that's kind of cool. On the other hand, it's also what's wrong with Chicago is because Chicago is so divided, is so segregated in so many ways. There are people, we saw people at the marches in episode 5 that I dare say, and it was great. It was inspiring, but we saw white folks at marches on certain parts of the South Side. I would bet that most of them had never been to that neighborhood before. Mm-hmm. And that's beautiful that they're there now and they're marching and they're making their voices heard. It's kind of sad that this is what kind of brought them there in the first place, right? So, Chicago, when I look at Chicago, I see America. I see sort of everything that I love and admire and am inspired by, and I see everything that I want to, shake my head at and grab it around the throat and change it. And I think that's Chicago. But the spirit of the people shines through no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you guys so much. Zach, Steve, City's So Real, an amazing project. I'm glad we can talk about it one more time. It's a spring showcase this year.
Thanks so much for having us as part of the showcase. It's really exciting.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Great interview.